On his 65th birthday, at the three Michelin-starred Perse, Arthur proudly presented his son Michael and daughter-in-law Chloe with a gift he had been searching for, a rare 19th-century architectural sketch. Chloe held the sketch up with two fingers as if it were dirty. "It's classic, Dad," she said, a cold smile. "But in the world of contemporary art, this really has no value. It's more like a decoration for a professor's office." She turned to her husband, her voice loud enough for Arthur to hear. "Darling, next time please remind me to give Dad a gift list, something a little more practical." Arthur looked at his son, pleading for protection. But Michael just silently bowed his head to his plate. "I guess 99% of you will hear this, sigh and scroll past, not clicking like or subscribe. Even if it only takes a second. What time is it for you? And where are you listening?" Arthur believed that a man's 65th birthday deserved a certain quiet dignity. It was a milestone, after all, a moment to take stock, not with a raucous party, but with a good suit, a fine meal, and the company of the person who mattered most. In his case, that was his son Michael, and by extension Michael's wife Chloe. He adjusted his tie in the hall mirror of his Upper West Side apartment, the familiar reflection showing a man of academia. A tweed jacket for every day, but a well-loved Brioni suit for an occasion like this. On the console table beside him lay the gift, a flat portfolio carefully wrapped in simple, elegant craft paper. He had spent months tracking it down, his heart leaping when it finally appeared at a small auction in Vienna. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't expensive in the way Chloe understood value. It was something better. It was thoughtful. He hoped, with a sincerity that felt almost boyish, that they would love it. An hour later, they were seated at Perse. The restaurant was less a dining room and more a hushed cathedral of gastronomy, suspended high above Columbus Circle. Through the vast windows, the lights of Central Park twinkled like a fallen constellation. The service was a silent, flawless ballet. Water glasses were filled as if by magic. Silverware was replaced with tongs. It was Chloe's choice, of course. A place where the tasting menu started at $350 a person and ascended into the stratosphere from there. It was a world of meticulous perfection, and tonight Arthur wanted to believe it could be the perfect setting for a warm family memory. After the first exquisite course, oysters and pearls, a delicate dance of sabayon and caviar, Arthur decided the moment was right. He slid the portfolio across the crisp white linen. "I found it at a small auction in Vienna," he said, his voice warm with the pride of a successful hunt. "I thought it would be a great inspiration for you, Michael, for the thesis." Michael's eyes lit up with genuine curiosity as he began to untie the string, but Chloe's hand was faster. She intercepted the package, her movements sharp and proprietary. She unwrapped it, revealing a matted sepia-toned sketch, an intricate, hand-drawn elevation of a small public library, signed by a little-known but brilliant 19th-century architect Michael was studying. Chloe held the sketch up with two perfectly manicured fingers, as if it were a dusty, slightly contaminated object. She glanced at Michael, whose initial interest had been instantly muted by her intervention, then turned her gaze to Arthur. A small, cold smile played on her lips. "Really classic, Dad," she said, the word classic landing like a pejorative. "But you know, in the art world, the contemporary art world, these things aren't really valuable. It's more like a decoration for a professor's office." Arthur felt a sharp, sudden chill, as if a window had been opened onto the cold night air. His pride, so warm and full just a moment ago, deflated instantly. Then Chloe leaned toward Michael, her voice a conspiratorial whisper, yet pitched just loud enough for Arthur to hear every single devastating word. "Honey, next time remind me that we should give Dad a gift list, for things with a little more reality to them." The silence that followed was immense. Arthur's gaze flew to his son, a desperate, silent plea for him to say something, anything, to defend the gift, to defend him. But Michael did not meet his eyes. He looked down, suddenly fascinated by the intricate swirl of creme fraiche in his second course, which had just been placed before him. He picked up his mother-of-pearl spoon and took a careful bite, a small, cowardly act of surrender. It was that silence, more than Chloe's cruel words, that cut Arthur to the bone. It was complicity. It was confirmation that he was on the outside now. The rest of the dinner passed in a tense, awkward haze. The food was magnificent, a parade of tiny, perfect works of art that tasted of nothing. Chloe and Michael spoke of things Arthur could not comprehend: the secondary market for a certain Chelsea artist, the cap rate on a commercial real estate project in Soho. They spoke a language of assets and acquisitions, a dialect of market value that left no room for sentiment or history. He was an immigrant in his own son's life, unable to understand the local tongue. After the polite, hollow goodbyes under the awning of the Deutsche Bank Center, Arthur declined the offer of a taxi and chose to walk. The crisp night air felt good on his face as he made his way home through the familiar streets of the Upper West Side. He looked into the warmly lit windows of the brownstones he passed, seeing the silhouettes of other families, and felt a profound and aching loneliness. He had always taken pride in his world, a world of books, of history, of ideas. He believed in a legacy of knowledge and affection, passed from one generation to the next. But tonight Chloe had held that world up with two fingers and declared it worthless. And his son, by his silence, had agreed. Arthur began to feel a creeping, unfamiliar sensation. He felt outdated. He felt irrelevant in the glittering, high-stakes world his son now inhabited. And he wondered with a deep and desolate sadness why Michael had allowed his wife to control him so completely, and what exactly he had done to lose his own son. The phone call came 4 days after the disastrous birthday dinner. It was Chloe, her voice a syrupy concoction of warmth and concern that immediately put Arthur on high alert. It was a tone she had never used with him before. "Arthur, darling," she began, the endearment so unnatural it was almost comical. "Michael and I were thinking, the city is so lovely this time of year. We'd love for you to join us for a walk on the High Line this afternoon. A change of scenery. We'll grab a coffee. It will be lovely." A change of scenery. Arthur understood the subtext perfectly. It meant leaving his territory, the book-lined, memory-soaked Upper West Side, for hers, the chic, sterile art gallery and condo world of Chelsea. He felt a profound reluctance, a weariness at the thought of another performance. But he was also a father, and some stubborn, vestigial piece of him still hoped. He agreed. The High Line was a masterpiece of urban reinvention, a ribbon of curated wilderness suspended above the city streets. They strolled among the meticulously designed flower beds and modern art installations, a river of tourists and impossibly stylish New Yorkers flowing around them. The air was filled with the scent of autumn grasses and expensive coffee. It was all very beautiful and very calculated, and Arthur felt a deep, unsettling sense of artifice. Chloe, however, was in her element. She pointed out architectural details and gossiped about the artists who lived in the luxury lofts that lined the park. Then she stopped, her gaze fixed on a futuristic, curvilinear apartment building taking shape against the sky. "Look, Dad," she said, her voice filled with a reverence she usually reserved for auction prices. "That's a Zaha Hadid. That's the future. Michael has an opportunity to get involved in a similar project, a boutique development. The returns are astronomical. The only issue is the initial capital." She turned to Michael, a silent, commanding look. Michael cleared his throat, avoiding his father's eyes. He looked out at the view, at the Statue of Liberty tiny in the distance, as if reciting a speech he'd been forced to memorize. "Dad," he began, his voice hesitant, "your apartment, with the current market on the Upper West Side, it's worth a significant amount. A lot more than you paid for it. If you were to sell it and invest with us in this project, the profit would—" Arthur interrupted him. His voice was not loud, but it was so cold it seemed to freeze the air around them. "Sell the apartment?" He turned from Michael to look directly at Chloe, the true author of this proposal. "The apartment that your mother and I lived in for 40 years? The apartment you grew up in, Michael? You want me to sell it for an investment?" Chloe didn't flinch. She met his furious gaze with a placid, almost pitying look, as if he were a sweet but simple-minded old man who couldn't grasp a basic financial concept. She gave a small shrug. "It's called leveraging an asset, Dad," she said, her tone nonchalant, "instead of just letting it sit there, dying. The word was a punch to the gut. His home, the container of his entire adult life, of his marriage, of his son's childhood, of Sarah's lingering scent on a cashmere scarf, a dead asset. Arthur felt a bitter, acidic anger rise in his throat. He saw it all with perfect clarity now. The dinner at Persay wasn't just a casual cruelty. It was the opening salvo in a campaign. They were testing him, devaluing his world to see if he would be weak enough to let them plunder it. They weren't ungrateful children. They were predators. "The apartment is not for sale," he said, each word a block of ice. "The conversation is over." Chloe's mask of sweetness finally dropped. Her expression hardened into something cold and resentful. Michael just looked lost, his gaze flickering between his furious father and his furious wife, a man caught in a crossfire of his own making. The walk back was silent and excruciatingly short. A few days later, Michael called. He sounded exhausted and genuinely apologetic. "Dad, I am so sorry about the other day. It was... Chloe was out of line. I was out of line. She feels terrible, really. We want to make it up to you. We want to give you a real birthday celebration." Arthur was silent, waiting. The cold vigilance he now felt was a new, unfamiliar sensation. "Just us, Dad," Michael continued, his voice pleading. "No fancy restaurants. We'll meet at the 72nd Street subway station and go grab a bite somewhere in the old neighborhood. Like old times. Please, Dad, it would mean the world to me. Like old times." The phrase was a lie, so blatant and yet so tempting. Arthur no longer harbored any illusions about them. His sadness had been replaced by a deep, wary suspicion. He knew this wasn't about reconciliation. This was another move, another tactic in a game he didn't fully understand. But why the subway station? Why the pretense of returning to the past? He should have said no. He should have hung up the phone and fortified the walls of his dead asset against them. But he didn't. He accepted the invitation, less out of hope and more out of a morbid curiosity to see the final act of this strange, sad play. He wanted to know just how far they were willing to go. The 72nd Street subway station was, in its own way, a work of art. Intricate mosaic tiles depicting the nearby Dakota building shimmered under the fluorescent lights, a touch of Gilded Age elegance in the grimy depths of the city. But Arthur felt none of its beauty. He stood on the crowded downtown platform, a knot of cold vigilance in his stomach, the rumble of approaching trains a low thrum of dread. Chloe and Michael were already there, waiting by a steel pillar. They were a portrait of feigned cheerfulness. Chloe wore a cream-colored cashmere coat, looking ridiculously out of place, while Michael offered a tight, nervous smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Dad, you made it," Michael said, his voice overly bright. "We were just deciding where to go. Maybe that old Italian place you used to love on Amsterdam?" Arthur didn't respond to the bait. The lie of like old times was too grotesque to acknowledge. He bypassed Chloe, stepping closer to his son, forcing Michael to look at him. They were near the yellow warning line at the edge of the platform. The air grew thick with unspoken things. "Michael," Arthur said, his voice low and steady, cutting through the pretense. "I need you to answer me honestly, right now. What is really going on?" He saw the panic flash in his son's eyes. Michael's gaze darted away, toward the dark tunnel, toward his wife, anywhere but at his father. He looked like a trapped animal. The curated confidence of per se and the High Line had evaporated, leaving only a weak, frightened man. "Dad, I'm sorry," Michael stammered, the words dissolving into a pathetic mumble. A shadow fell over Arthur. Chloe had moved to stand directly behind him, her presence a sudden, chilling drop in temperature. He could feel the proximity of her expensive perfume. Her voice, when she spoke, was a parody of sweetness, a creepy, saccharine whisper right next to his ear. "He's sorry it's over, Dad." And then the world disappeared. A hard, violent shove slammed into the center of his back. There was no time to react, only a horrifying sensation of weightlessness as his feet left the platform. The air rushed past him, the station's mosaics blurring into a meaningless smear of color. He hit the grimy tract with a brutal, bone-jarring impact. A sharp, searing pain shot through his left shoulder as it connected with a steel rail. The world was a chaotic jumble of the smell of grease and ozone, the sharp bite of gravel against his cheek. Then came the sound, a deafening roar, a high-pitched metallic scream that vibrated through his entire body. A blast of hot, foul wind hit him. Headlights, two blinding suns, burst from the darkness of the tunnel. The express train. There was no thought, only a primal cellular scream for survival. In a single, desperate movement, Arthur threw himself sideways, rolling into the shallow trough between the rails. He flattened his body against the grimy ballast, pressing his face into the dirt, his hands clamped over his head. The next 10 seconds were an eternity in hell. The train passed over him, a roaring, thundering beast of steel and fire. The noise was absolute, a physical force that threatened to tear him apart. He felt the immense, terrifying weight of the carriages just inches above him, saw the sparks from the wheels showering down like malevolent fireflies. The world was a vortex of noise, wind, and the horrifying certainty of imminent death. Then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. The red taillights of the last car vanished down the tunnel. A profound, ringing silence descended, broken only by the drip of water from the ceiling and the frantic, ragged sound of his own breathing. He lay there for a long moment, his body screaming in a dozen places. But he was alive. The pain was a confirmation of it. Slowly, deliberately, he pushed himself up. His suit was torn, his hands were bleeding, and a warm trickle of blood ran from his hairline into his eye. He was a wreck, but he was alive. Using the platform edge, he hauled his aching body up, his movements stiff but steady. He stood there, on the platform, blinking in the harsh light, a ghost risen from the grave. And he saw them. They hadn't run. They stood frozen, about 20 feet away, near the pillar where they had been waiting. Their faces were masks of pure, incredulous horror, and on their lips the last vestiges of frozen smiles. Not smiles of joy, but the sick, twisted smiles of release, of a problem they thought had just been solved. The smiles they had worn as they watched him fall. Arthur said nothing. He didn't scream. He didn't cry out. He simply stood there, covered in the filth of the subway tracks. He looked at his bleeding hands, then slowly, with an unnerving calm, he brushed the dust from the front of his ruined suit jacket. He straightened his shoulders, ignoring the bolt of pain from his dislocated shoulder. Then he lifted his head and looked at them. He looked at his son, the weak, pathetic boy who had stood by and smiled. He looked at his daughter-in-law, the ruthless monster hiding behind a veneer of civility. The man who had been pushed onto the tracks was a gentle, intellectual father, a man of books and reason. The man who had climbed back up was someone else entirely. The love was gone, crushed to dust under the wheels of the train. Every ounce of fatherly affection had been scoured from his soul, replaced by an iron will and a single crystal-clear purpose. He held their gaze, and in his eyes they saw a look they would never forget for the rest of their lives. It was not a look of pain or fear. It was a promise of a storm to come. The chaos that erupted on the platform was immediate and overwhelming. A transit officer's frantic voice crackled over a radio, a passenger screamed, and soon the station was a swirl of police officers and paramedics. Arthur, to everyone's astonishment, was already on his feet, a pillar of shocking, bloodied calm in the eye of the hurricane. He refused a stretcher, waving away the concerned paramedics, but agreed, with a quiet nod, to go to the hospital for an evaluation. As they led him away, he watched Chloe and Michael spring into action. It was a masterful performance. Chloe was weeping hysterically into Michael's shoulder, a damsel in distress, while Michael played the part of the stoic, traumatized son, one arm wrapped protectively around his wife, his face a mask of anguish. They were no longer predators. They were victims of a terrible, tragic accident. Arthur watched them, his mind cold and clear, and felt nothing but a profound analytical contempt. The emergency room at New York Presbyterian was a world away from the grimy subway station. It was clean, quiet, and exuded an aura of expensive, efficient care. Arthur sat on a hospital bed in a private cubicle, a doctor gently cleaning the gash on his forehead. His dislocated shoulder had been reset, a brutally painful procedure he had endured with barely a sound, and his arm was now in a sling. He was an observer, a quiet analyst watching the next scene of the play unfold. An NYPD detective, a weary-looking man named O'Malley, came in. He held a small notepad. Chloe and Michael stood in the doorway, their performance now dialed to a more subtle, somber key for the benefit of law enforcement. "Mr. Grant," O'Malley began, his voice gentle, "I'm just trying to understand what happened down there. Your son and daughter-in-law are, understandably, very shaken up." He gestured toward the doorway. Chloe's eyes were red-rimmed and swollen. Her voice trembled convincingly as she took her cue, clutching Michael's hand as if for dear life. "Detective, we've been so worried about him," she said, her words catching in a perfect sob. "Ever since my mother-in-law, Sarah, passed away, he just hasn't been himself. He gets confused. He talks about conspiracies, about people being after him. He's become so paranoid. Michael nodded, his expression a study in pained filial duty. He got this idea in his head that we wanted to take his property. It's all he talks about. Today, we just wanted to take him out for a nice dinner, to cheer him up. His voice broke. We were waiting for the train, and all of a sudden, he just said, "I can't take it anymore," and he jumped. Oh my God, we tried to grab him, but it was so fast. It was a brilliant, vicious lie. A story so plausible, so perfectly crafted, it was almost a work of art. They were using his greatest vulnerability, his profound, all-consuming grief for his wife, and twisting it into a weapon against him. They were painting him as an unstable, suicidal old man, and themselves as the dutiful, long-suffering children. The detective made a few notes, his face impassive. Then he turned to Arthur. "Sir, is that how you remember it?" This was the moment. The old Arthur, the one who had died on the tracks, would have screamed the truth. He would have raged, accused, and in his injured and emotional state, he would have looked exactly like the unhinged man Chloe had just described. But the new Arthur was a strategist. He knew that in this clean, quiet room, with no evidence but his own incredible story against their perfectly calibrated performance, the truth was a liability. He looked at the detective, allowing a flicker of confusion to cloud his eyes. He touched the fresh bandage on his head. I'm in shock," he said, his voice a weak, raspy whisper. "The train, it was so loud. I'm sorry, detective. I don't remember it clearly." He saw the flicker of triumph in Chloe's eyes. He saw the wave of relief wash over Michael's face. They thought he was broken. They thought they had won. Let them. He would use the role they had written for him. He would play the part of the sad, senile old man. And he would use that cover to plan his war. "We'll check the security cameras, sir," O'Malley said, closing his notepad. "It's just procedure. You get some rest." The detective's words, meant to be routine, hung in the air, a seed of anxiety planted in the middle of Chloe and Michael's victory. Hours later, Arthur was discharged. He took a taxi back to his apartment, the dead asset they had tried to murder him for. He walked through the familiar rooms, the pain in his shoulder, a dull, constant throb, a reminder of what had been done. He did not rest. He did not pour himself a drink. He walked into his study, sat down at his desk, and picked up the phone. He didn't call the police. He didn't call a therapist. He called his real estate lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Helen. "Helen, it's Arthur Grant," he said, his voice no longer weak or confused. It was the voice of a man giving a command, clear, sharp, and absolutely determined. "I need you to come to my apartment first thing tomorrow morning. I want to begin the process of transferring the ownership of my property into an irrevocable trust, effective immediately." It was the first move in a game they didn't even know he was playing. He was building a fortress. He was protecting his assets, yes, but he was also doing something more. He was setting the board for his revenge, and they, in their arrogance, had just handed him the perfect disguise to do it. While Arthur was fortifying his legal defenses, his son and daughter-in-law were living in a fortress of a different kind. Their penthouse in Hudson Yards was a sterile temple to new money, a glass box in the sky with panoramic views of the Hudson River. The furniture was minimalist and brutally expensive. The art on the walls was abstract and emotionally vacant, and the silence between them was growing louder than the city below. Michael was pacing, a caged, frantic energy radiating from him as he walked back and forth across the polished concrete floors. "Are you sure no one saw anything?" "What about the cameras, Chloe?" "O'Malley said they'd check the cameras." "We never should have done it. My God, he's my father." Chloe was seated on a low-slung Italian sofa, swirling a glass of pale, cold Sauvignon Blanc. She looked at her husband's agitation with an expression of pure contempt. "Oh, do stop it, Michael," she said, her voice sharp and dismissive. "Don't get all moralistic on me now. It's unbecoming. Do you have any idea what happens if we don't get that capital infusion? My gallery, your consulting career, this apartment, all of it is built on a foundation that is about to crumble. Your father is sitting on a gold mine he doesn't know what to do with. In a way, we were trying to help him." Michael stopped pacing and stared at her, his face a mask of disbelief. "Help him? By killing him?" Chloe placed her wine glass down on the marble coaster with a sharp, definitive click. Her voice was low and venomous. It was an unfortunate accident that no one will ever be able to prove. The problem isn't the plan, it's that you're weak. You stood there frozen. You have no stomach for what needs to be done. You're just like him. The insult hung in the air between them, a fresh crack in their crumbling alliance. Michael flinched as if she'd slapped him. He saw in her eyes not a partner, but a predator who had just decided he might be her next meal. Meanwhile, back in the quiet, book-lined warmth of the Upper West Side, Arthur was moving the first pieces across his own chessboard. His arm was still in a sling, a useful prop for the role of the frail, recovering victim he was now playing. He sat in his study and made a call to an old friend, George, a semi-retired forensic accountant with a mind like a steel trap. "George, an old friend needs a quiet favor," Arthur began, his voice sounding intentionally tired. "My son and his wife are involved in a new art world venture. They've suggested I invest. I'd hate for Michael to get mixed up in something unstable at this stage. I was hoping you could ask around, through your contacts in banking, see if there are any rumors about his wife's gallery. The Chloe Devereaux Gallery in Chelsea." 3 days later, George called back. His tone was grim. "Arthur, stay away from this," he said, no preamble necessary. "Your daughter-in-law's gallery is a house of cards. She's leveraged to the hilt. She bet the farm on an emerging artist whose market completely collapsed. Worse, it sounds like she used restricted investor funds to do it. The whispers on the street are that a couple of her major backers are about to file a lawsuit that will bankrupt her and likely lead to fraud charges. She's not just in debt, Arthur. She's on the verge of ruin." Arthur hung up the phone. He felt no surprise, only a cold, dark satisfaction. The motive, raw and desperate, was now laid bare. This wasn't about ambition, it was about survival. The next afternoon, Arthur took a taxi to Chelsea. He walked into the Chloe Devereaux Gallery. It was a vast white space, cold and silent. A young, fashionable woman at the front desk looked up, startled to see an elderly man in a sling, his suit slightly rumpled, looking around with a dazed expression. He ignored her, walking slowly through the exhibit. He looked at the large, meaningless canvases on the walls, his face a mask of polite, slightly confused interest. At the back of the gallery, he saw Chloe in her glass-walled office, frozen, her face pale with shock at his sudden appearance on her turf. He didn't go to her. He completed his circuit of the room, and on his way out, he stopped at the front desk. Chloe had emerged from her office, standing stiffly by the doorway, watching him. Arthur turned to her, offering a small, sad smile that did not reach his cold, clear eyes. He gestured vaguely at the art around him. "I just wanted to see the gallery you've both worked so hard to build," he said, his voice gentle, almost paternal. "It's very ambitious." He paused, letting the word hang in the air. Then he delivered the final, fatal blow. "I hope everything is okay." He watched the last traces of color drain from her face. He saw the flicker of raw panic in her eyes. It was a simple, polite question, but they both knew what he was really saying. I know you're failing. I know you're desperate. I know everything." He turned and walked out, leaving her standing alone in her beautiful, failing gallery, the siege having now officially begun. Arthur's plan for revenge was not a bomb, it was a virus. It would not be loud or explosive. It would be quiet, subtle, and designed to replicate in the hushed, gossipy ecosystem of the world Chloe held most dear. He began by planning a party. The phone call to Chloe was a masterpiece of feigned vulnerability. "Chloe, my dear," he'd said, his voice imbued with the gentle frailty of a man on the mend. "Now that I'm feeling a bit stronger, I feel I must host a small gathering, just to thank everyone who has been so supportive. It would mean the world to me if you and Michael were here. It wouldn't feel right without you." It was an invitation she couldn't refuse. To decline would look callous, confirming the very instability in their family relationship she was trying so desperately to conceal. She was forced to accept, a fact that Arthur relished with a cold, private satisfaction. On the night of the party, Arthur's apartment was transformed. It was no longer a place of grief, but a warm, inviting salon. He had hired a private chef from Jean-Georges, and the scent of truffle and roasting duck wafted from the kitchen. Waiters in crisp white jackets moved silently through the rooms, refilling glasses with a fine burgundy he'd selected from his cellar. The space, filled with his beloved books and art, felt authentic and lived in, a stark, deliberate contrast to the soulless minimalism of Chloe and Michael's penthouse. The guest list was small but lethal. He invited a few old family friends, his lawyer Helen, and two very special additions: a famously sharp-tongued art critic from Art Forum, and Robert Davenport, a silver-haired financier in his late 60s who was, as Arthur had learned from his accountant friend, one of the primary investors in the Chloe Devereaux Gallery. Chloe and Michael arrived looking like a power couple from a magazine, but Arthur could see the tension simmering beneath the surface. Chloe's smile was a little too bright, a little too fixed, and Michael, after a stiff hello, made a beeline for the bar and remained there, his torment manifesting in the increasing frequency with which he signaled the waiter. Arthur played the part of the gracious, slightly befuddled host to perfection. His arm was still in the sling, a constant visual reminder of his accident. He mingled, he told old stories, he accepted sympathies, and then he made his move. He found Robert Davenport admiring a small landscape painting near the fireplace. "I'm so glad you could come, Robert," Arthur said, his voice warm as he held his glass of Burgundy. "I just wanted to thank everyone who was so present for me during this difficult time, especially Chloe. She was terribly worried." Davenport, a man accustomed to seeing the world in terms of risk and reward, nodded politely. "Of course, Arthur. We were all shocked to hear the news. Chloe is a rising star. We have very high hopes for her." Arthur looked away from the investor, his gaze turning inward, his expression becoming pensive and clouded with fatherly concern. "Yes," he sighed, "a masterclass in subtle performance. She's so ambitious. A real force. Sometimes I worry she's betting a bit too much on the unknown. The art world, like life, is so full of unexpected risks, isn't it?" He turned back to Davenport, his eyes full of earnest sincerity. "I just hope she's prepared for every eventuality." He didn't say bankruptcy. He didn't say fraud. He said risks and eventualities. But to a man like Robert Davenport, a man whose entire career was built on reading between the lines, the message was as clear as a subpoena. He was a worried father-in-law, sharing a gentle, confidential concern. But he was also planting a seed of doubt, a red flag that would flutter in the back of the investor's mind long after the party was over. Davenport's polite smile tightened just a fraction. A furrow of calculation appeared between his brows. The virus had been transmitted. Arthur watched Chloe from across the room. He saw her notice him talking to Davenport. He saw the flicker of panic in her eyes, the way her hand tightened around the stem of her wine glass. She knew exactly what he was doing, but she was powerless to stop it. To interrupt would be to create a scene, to admit that there was something worth interrupting. She was trapped in the gilded cage of her own social rules. Later, as the party was winding down, Arthur saw Chloe corner Michael by the bookshelves, her face a mask of fury. He couldn't hear the words, but he could see the venom in her hissed whispers, the way Michael flinched and looked away, taking another large swallow of his drink. The crack between them was widening into a chasm. After the last guest had departed, Arthur stood alone in his quiet apartment. The scent of expensive food and perfume lingered in the air. He felt a cruel, unfamiliar joy. It was the joy of a chess master who has just moved his queen into a winning position. He had not laid a hand on them. He had simply used their world, their language of whispers and insinuations against them, and he knew with absolute certainty that the time bomb he had activated tonight was now ticking. "I guess 99% of you will hear this," sigh and scroll past, not clicking like or subscribe. Even if it only takes a second, what time is it for you, and where are you listening? The time bomb Arthur had planted at the party did not take long to detonate. The fallout was quiet but seismic. Whispers turned into inquiries, and inquiries turned into a full-blown forensic audit of the Chloe Devereaux Gallery's finances, demanded by a suddenly very nervous Robert Davenport. But just as Arthur was gaining the upper hand on one front, he suffered a major setback on another. A call from Detective O'Malley delivered the news with a tone of weary resignation. "Mr. Grant, I'm afraid I have some frustrating news," the detective said. "We finally got the footage from the MTA for the time of your incident at 72nd Street. He paused. There was a technical glitch, a data writing error. The cameras on that section of the platform were down for a 2-hour window. We have footage of you all entering the station and footage of the aftermath, but the crucial 2 minutes, it's a blank. I'm sorry. Without a witness or a recording, it's your word against theirs. Legally, my hands are tied. Arthur felt a cold knot of frustration. The one piece of impartial, irrefutable evidence was gone. Chloe and Michael had gotten lucky. For a moment, he felt the despair creeping back. Then, he looked at his own hands, one still healing, and his resolve hardened into a new, colder shape. If the world wouldn't provide him with a weapon, he would have to forge one himself. And he knew exactly where to find the raw materials, in the weak, cracking soul of his own son. He knew Michael was the weak link, crushed between a wife he feared and a father he had wronged, suffocated by a guilt he was too cowardly to confess. He was a man on the verge of breaking. Arthur decided to give him a final, gentle push. He called Michael's cell. "Michael," he said, his voice quiet, infused with a deep, paternal sadness that was entirely feigned. "We need to talk. About your mother." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Meet me at Bemelman's in an hour." Bemelman's bar at the Carlisle Hotel was a deliberate choice. It was a place of quiet, civilized elegance, its walls covered in the whimsical, charming murals of Ludwig Bemelmans. It was a place where gentlemen had quiet conversations over expensive cocktails. It was the last place on earth one would expect an ugly, emotional outburst. It was the perfect cage. Michael arrived looking haunted. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his hand trembled slightly as he picked up the old-fashioned the waiter placed before him. He thought he was here for a sentimental talk about his mother, a prospect that his guilty conscience had twisted into an unbearable form of torture. Arthur let the silence stretch, a form of pressure more potent than any accusation. He simply sat, his expression unreadable, and waited. It worked. The silence, combined with the guilt and the whiskey, unraveled him. "Dad, I can't do this anymore," Michael blurted out, stirring his drink with a frantic energy. "That party, Chloe's losing her mind. Davenport called for a full audit of the gallery. She says it's my fault, that I'm not supporting her. She blames me for everything." Arthur just looked at him, his gaze level, his face a perfect blank. He said nothing. "Is that so?" he finally prompted, his voice neutral. The dam broke. The words came tumbling out, a pathetic, desperate torrent of self-preservation. "It was her idea, Dad. All of it. The talk about the apartment. The thing at the station. It was all Chloe. I tried to tell her no, but she has this way of twisting things, of making you feel like you're the crazy one. I was scared, Dad. I was so scared of losing everything." He was not confessing out of remorse. He was confessing out of fear. He was throwing his wife to the wolves to save his own skin. It was the ultimate act of cowardice, and it was exactly what Arthur had been counting on. He listened, his heart a cold, hard stone in his chest, as his son detailed the plan, the desperation, the final, monstrous decision. As Michael was reaching the climax of his wretched story, she said it was the only way, that it had to look like an accident. That's what she meant when she said, "It's over," the thing at the train station. Arthur allowed his gaze to drop for a fraction of a second. He glanced down at his iPhone, which he had placed on the dark wood of the table when he'd first sat down. The screen was active, and on it the unmistakable red icon and pulsing waveform of the voice memo app, which had been silently, faithfully recording for the last 15 minutes. New York is a one-party consent state. The recording was perfectly legal. With the physical evidence of the cameras gone, Arthur had just created his own. It was a brutal, calculated act of paternal betrayal, a violation of the last shred of trust his son might have had in him. He felt a flicker of disgust at himself, at what he had been forced to become, but that disgust was quickly overwhelmed by the cold, clean feeling of a weapon being locked and loaded. He had it. The confession. The truth, in his son's own cowardly, damning words. This was the weapon that would end the war. The invitation was an act of pure, unadulterated hubris. It arrived on a Tuesday, a thick card of creamy, expensive stock, the ink of the calligraphy slightly raised to the touch. It requested the honor of Arthur Grant's presence at a party celebrating the publication of Emergent Vision, the first official catalog of the Chloe Devereaux Gallery. It was a monument to the very artist, whose spectacular market collapse had been the catalyst for her financial ruin. To host a lavish party in its honor was not just denial, it was a declaration of war against reality itself. Chloe was not in retreat. She was doubling down, betting that the sheer, glittering force of her social standing could bend the world to her will. She believed the camera glitch was a sign from the universe that she was untouchable, that Arthur's subsequent silence was the whimper of a defeated old man. Staging this coronation and inviting him to witness it was her way of twisting the knife, of demonstrating her absolute, final victory. Arthur held the card in his hand, a faint, cold smile touching his lips. It was a fatal miscalculation. He RSVP'd yes immediately. His next call was not to a friend or a lawyer, but to George, the retired forensic accountant. "George," Arthur said, his voice a low, calm instrument of purpose, "I have one last, rather unusual favor to ask. I need a recommendation. Not for an accountant, but for a freelance audiovisual technician, the best in the city, a ghost. Someone who understands how to discreetly interface with the integrated sound and projection systems of a commercial art gallery. The budget is unlimited." The night of the party was a tableau of the Chelsea art scene at its most self-congratulatory. The gallery, a cavernous white cube, had been transformed. Subtle colored uplighting made the cavernous space feel almost intimate. Waiters, looking like models themselves in their minimalist black uniforms, navigated the crush with trays of champagne and meticulously constructed canapes, a single quail egg with a dot of caviar, a sliver of foie gras on a brioche crisp. A DJ tucked away in a corner spun a low thumping electronic beat that was more a vibration in the chest than a melody. The room was a sea of the powerful, the beautiful, and the predatory. Arthur saw artists in paint-splattered designer jackets, collectors with faces tightened by both surgery and shrewd calculation, and critics whose expressions of bored indifference were their most valuable professional asset. This was Chloe's pantheon, the gods and demigods of the world she had clawed her way into. And tonight she was their high priestess, radiant and triumphant in a severe architectural black dress, a slash of red lipstick her only color. Arthur's arrival was a carefully orchestrated performance. He timed it for an hour after the start, when the party was at its peak. He was still wearing the sling, a crucial part of his costume. He was the ghost of parties past, a tragic figure whose presence elicited murmurs of sympathy and morbid curiosity. Chloe and Michael, who were holding court near the entrance, saw him, and for a split second, a flicker of genuine shock crossed Chloe's face before her social mask snapped back into place. "Arthur, you came!" she exclaimed, gliding toward him, her voice a symphony of manufactured delight. She kissed the air an inch from his cheek, her perfume a cloud of expensive synthetic florals. "We're so thrilled you could make it. It means the world to have your support tonight." I wouldn't have missed it for the world," Arthur replied, his smile gentle, his eyes giving away nothing. He allowed Michael to give him an awkward, one-armed hug. His son's hand was clammy, his eyes darting around the room, unable to meet his father's gaze for more than a second. Arthur could smell the whiskey on his breath already. He was a man drowning his guilt in premium liquor. Arthur took a glass of still water from a passing waiter and retreated to a quiet corner, near a large, meaningless abstract painting. From there, he watched. He was a director observing his own intricate stage play in the moments before the climax. He noted the key players, Robert Davenport, the investor, looking stern and watchful near the bar, the influential critic from Art Forum, holding court with a group of fawning artists. He saw the journalists from the Times and the Post. The entire ecosystem was present. He felt a detached, almost clinical sense of calm. He checked his phone. A single text from the AV technician, received an hour ago, read simply, "System access established. Awaiting your signal." Arthur had the app open, his thumb resting near the single, large, red button on the screen. An hour later, the moment arrived. The DJ's music faded. A gallery assistant tapped a microphone, and Chloe ascended a small, temporary podium at the center of the room. A large projection screen behind her, which had been displaying a rotating slideshow of the gallery's artists, now showed a high-resolution image of the cover of her catalog. A hush of expectant self-importance fell over the crowd. Thank you all, my wonderful, brilliant friends, for being here tonight, Chloe began, her voice smooth and confident, resonating through the high-end sound system. This book, this collection, is more than just art. It represents a vision, a belief in the future, a commitment to taking the bold risks necessary to discover the next great voice of our generation. She was magnificent, Arthur had to admit. A perfect, polished lie in a designer dress. He watched her as she basked in the attention, the adulation, the culmination of all her desperate striving. And of course, she continued, her voice softening with a note of theatrical emotion, I could not have done any of this without the unwavering support of my incredible husband, Michael, and my wonderful, resilient father-in-law, Arthur, during what has been a challenging but ultimately rewarding time. She beamed a brilliant, false smile in his direction. That was his cue. With a steady hand, Arthur pressed the red button. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. The image of the book cover on the screen behind Chloe flickered and died, replaced by the stark, pulsing green and black waveform of an audio file. The low hum of the DJ's track was cut off mid-beat, and then, from every speaker in the gallery, a new sound emerged, crystal clear in the sudden, shocked silence. It was the gentle clinking of ice in a heavy glass tumbler. Then, a voice, Michael's voice, trembling, desperate, stripped of all its social polish. It was her idea, Dad. Everything. The talk about the apartment, the thing at the train station. It was all Chloe. I tried to tell her no, but she has this way of twisting things, of making you feel like you're the crazy one. I was scared, Dad. I was so scared of losing everything. She said it was the only way, that it had to look like an accident. That's what she meant when she said it's over. The silence that followed the recording was a living entity. It was a physical pressure, a vacuum that sucked all the air and warmth and smug self-satisfaction out of the room. Every polite smile was frozen. Every half-sipped glass of champagne hung suspended in mid-air. The only sound was the almost imperceptible hum of the gallery's climate control system. Time seemed to slow down. Arthur watched as 100 heads, 100 pairs of eyes, swiveled as one, away from the screen and toward the podium. They fixed upon Chloe. Her face was a canvas of absolute ruin. The color had drained away, leaving a waxy, bloodless pallor. Her mouth was slightly open, her bright red lipstick a grotesque gash in the white mask of her face. Her confident posture had crumbled. The spell broke. The silence was shattered not by a scream, but by a gasp, then a chorus of them. The whispers started, a low, venomous hiss that spread through the crowd like a contagion. Then came the modern-day torches and pitchforks, the cell phones. Dozens of them were raised, their small red recording lights blinking, documenting the social execution for posterity. Chloe stood paralyzed, a statue of her own destruction. Michael, near the bar, looked as if he'd been struck by lightning, the champagne flute finally slipping from his nerveless fingers and shattering on the polished concrete floor with a sound that was shockingly loud in the tense atmosphere. The predators in the room sensed blood. The journalist from the Times, her eyes alight with the savage thrill of a career-making story, was already pushing through the paralyzed crowd, her phone recording. Chloe, do you have a comment on the recording? Was that your husband's voice? Robert Davenport was staring at Chloe, his face a thunderous mask of cold investor fury. He had not been merely embarrassed. He had been made a fool of, his money nearly stolen by a fraud and an attempted murderer. He turned on his heel and began barking orders into his own phone. Through it all, Arthur remained in his corner, a still point in the swirling chaos. He watched the beautiful, intricate world Chloe had built on a foundation of lies burn to the ground. He watched her being consumed by the flames of the very public opinion she had worshipped. He felt no pleasure, no elation, only the grim, quiet satisfaction of a complex, painful equation that had finally been solved. Justice, in its own brutal way, had been served. He placed his untouched glass of water down on a pedestal next to a sculpture. He turned and, without a single backward glance, walked toward the exit. He pushed open the heavy glass door and stepped out into the cool, clean night air, leaving the hell he had unleashed to its own righteous, screaming devices. I guess 99% of you will hear this. Sigh and scroll past, not clicking like or subscribe. Even if it only takes a second. What time is it for you, and where are you listening? The day after the book launch, the city was a symphony of whispers. Arthur woke not to the familiar, gentle quiet of his apartment, but to a new kind of silence, the profound calm at the center of a hurricane he himself had summoned. He made coffee with a steady hand, the simple domestic ritual, a stark contrast to the digital inferno raging beyond his walls. He sat at his kitchen table and opened his iPad. The story wasn't just news, it was a phenomenon. It was the lead story on every local news site, the trending topic on every social platform. The headline in the New York Post, printed in its signature bold, accusatory font, screamed, "Art of the Steal! Park Slope Patriarch exposes subway shove plot at Posh Gallery Bash." Below it was a grainy still from a guest's cell phone video. Chloe, her face a kabuki mask of horror, bathed in the flash of a dozen cameras. Michael, a blur of pathetic confusion in the background. The article was a masterpiece of tabloid savagery, detailing every sordid rumor with gleeful abandon. But it was the amateur videos, uploaded and shared millions of times, that served as the true public execution. They showed the moment in excruciating, looped detail, the confident smile on Chloe's face, the sudden hijack of the audio, the dawning, sickening realization, the collective gasp, the ensuing chaos. Arthur watched it all with the detached air of a historian studying a civilization's collapse. He felt no thrill, no joy, only a grim, weary sense of inevitability. He had simply held up a mirror, and their world had shattered. The official wheels of justice, which had been grinding in neutral, now engaged with astonishing speed. The call from Detective O'Malley came before noon. The man's voice, which had previously held a note of weary sympathy for a potentially unstable old man, was now crisp, deferential, and edged with a professional's respect for a well-played hand. "Mr. Grant," O'Malley said, the formality a clear sign of the shift in power, "I don't think I need to tell you that the recording you obtained changes the landscape of this investigation entirely. It constitutes a full confession and provides indisputable evidence of conspiracy. Warrants have been issued for the arrests of Chloe and Michael Miller. We'll be dispatching units to their last known addresses. Thank you for your assistance." Arthur simply said, "I see," and hung up. He had not done this for the police or for the courts. He had done it for himself and for Sarah. The official process was merely an epilogue. The disintegration of their alliance was swift and brutal, played out for the salivating public in the courts and the press. The united front of the power couple dissolved overnight into a frantic, ugly scramble for survival. The first casualty was their marriage. Chloe filed for divorce from her jail cell, the first salvo in a new war fought by lawyers in $1,000 suits. The dueling public statements were a masterclass in mutual destruction. Arthur read them in the morning paper, a clinical observer of the wreckage. Chloe's legal team painted her as the ultimate victim. "My client, a respected and visionary gallerist, has been subjected to a prolonged campaign of insidious psychological abuse and financial manipulation, first by her unstable, grieving father-in-law, and then by her weak-willed husband who buckled under the family pressure. Miss Devereaux intends to fight these baseless charges and expose the truth of what happened." "Oh." Michael's response, released hours later, was equally self-serving and pathetic. "My client, a loving and devoted son, was coerced into a devastating conspiracy, masterminded by his financially desperate and morally bankrupt wife. He has been cooperating fully with the district attorney's office from the moment the truth came to light and is committed to atoning for the role he was forced to play in this tragedy." Their lives, once a carefully curated exhibition of success, were now being publicly dismantled piece by piece. The Chloe Devereaux Gallery was sealed, its assets to be liquidated to pay off a stampede of furious investors led by a vengeful Robert Davenport. Michael was unceremoniously fired, his firm issuing a statement that they had severed all ties to protect their corporate reputation. The Hudson Yards penthouse, a monument to their hollow ambition, was sold at a loss to cover the mounting legal bills. Michael, stripped of his wife, his career, and his home, moved into a drab, temporary serviced apartment in Murray Hill, a man in freefall. Months bled into a year. The trial, when it finally came, was an anticlimax. The recording was the star witness, an unimpeachable narrator of their guilt. Faced with it, and with each other's desperate, contradictory testimony, their only strategy was to beg for mercy. Arthur sat in the back of the King's County Supreme Court, a solitary observer at the final act. He looked at the two people in the defendant's box. Chloe was a creature of pure, distilled rage, her face thin and hard, her eyes burning with a hateful fire. She had lost everything and blamed everyone but herself. Michael was simply a void. The life had been hollowed out of him, leaving a slumped, defeated shell. He looked up only once, his gaze briefly meeting Arthur's across the courtroom. There was nothing in his eyes, no plea, no apology, no recognition, just emptiness. Looking at him, Arthur felt a final, fleeting echo of pain. Not for the empty man sitting there, but for the bright, laughing boy in a photograph, the boy who used to cling to his father's neck after falling off his bike. That boy was gone. He had been gone for a very long time. This was just the burial. The judge's voice was a cold, final instrument of consequence. She spoke of greed, of a monstrous betrayal of familial trust, of a callous disregard for human life. Chloe, as the architect of the plot and the perpetrator of the physical assault, was sentenced to 15 to 20 years in a state correctional facility. Michael, for his cooperation and his lesser, though still unforgivable role, received a lighter sentence, 5 to 7 years. The sharp, definitive bang of the gavel was the last sound Arthur heard. He watched as they were led away, through separate doors, to their separate, ruined futures. He stood, his body feeling both immeasurably heavy and strangely light. He walked out of the courthouse and into the afternoon sun, leaving the fragments of their shattered lives behind him. The war was over. The victory was his, and it tasted like ash. The year that followed the sentencing was a year of quiet reclamation. The city's noise, the media storm, the legal battles, the gossip faded, leaving Arthur in a new kind of silence. It was not the aching void Sarah's death had left, nor the tense, strategic silence of his Cold War. It was a gentle, expansive quiet, the sound of a landscape after a long and brutal storm has finally passed, leaving the air clean and the ground soft. He began the slow, deliberate work of rebuilding. One spring morning, a thin institutional envelope arrived from an upstate correctional facility. It was the first and only letter he would receive from Michael. Arthur sat with it at his kitchen table for the better part of an hour, the unopened envelope a small white ghost on the polished wood. He had no desire to re-engage with the pain, but he knew he had to read it to truly close the door. The note inside was just a few lines, written in a hesitant, almost childlike script. "Dad, I am sorry. I know those words are not enough. They will never be enough. I think about Mom. I think about the man I was supposed to be. I hope you are okay. Michael." Arthur read the words, and what he felt was not anger or a rush of forgiveness, but a profound and bottomless pity. It was the confession of a hollow man, a final, pathetic admission of his own moral vacancy. Arthur folded the letter and put it away in a box of old papers. It was not a beginning, but an end, an epitaph for a son he had lost long before a judge's gavel had fallen. With that final fragment of the past put to rest, Arthur turned his attention to the future. He walked through his apartment, this grand, memory-soaked space that had been the stage for so much love and so much pain. His first instinct in the immediate aftermath had been to sell it, to flee the ghosts and the tainted memories. But now, that felt like a surrender. It felt like letting Chloe and Michael have the final say on what this home meant. He decided not to run. He would stay, he would transform. He started with Michael's old bedroom. For a year he had kept the door shut, unable to face the time capsule of a lost childhood. Now he opened it and saw not a tomb, but a possibility. He hired movers to clear out the room, packing away the dusty trophies and worn-out books. He had the walls repainted a warm, optimistic white. He tore out the old carpeting and had the original hardwood floors restored to a gleaming finish. In its place, he began to build a new kind of legacy. The single bed was replaced with a large, beautiful oak library table. The walls were lined with custom-built shelves, which he began to fill with the most treasured volumes from his own collection. First editions of architectural theory, rare books on urban planning, monographs of the great masters. One day, while sorting through a box of Michael's effects that had been sent from his lawyer's office, the sad final remnants of a life that had been liquidated, he found the portfolio. It was dusty and forgotten at the bottom of the box. He untied the string and pulled out the 19th century architectural sketch, the gift that had started it all, the beautiful, thoughtful object that had been held up with two fingers like a piece of filth and dismissed as a mere decoration for a professor's office. He held the drawing, its delicate lines a testament to a forgotten artist's vision. He thought of Chloe's cynical valuation, her belief that an object's only worth was its price on the contemporary market. She had been so spectacularly, tragically wrong. He took the sketch to the best framer on Madison Avenue and had it mounted in a simple, elegant frame behind museum-quality glass. It was not a trophy. It was a reclamation of his own values. He hung it on the main wall of the new library. Then, he made a few calls to old friends at Columbia and Pratt, putting the word out. The Arthur Grant study was now open. The first students to use the room were a pair of bright, intense graduate students working on a thesis about public spaces. Arthur watched them from the doorway as they spread their work across the oak table, their faces alive with the passion and frustration of the creative process. They were surrounded by the books he had spent a lifetime collecting, working under the gaze of the very sketch that had been so cruelly rejected. He walked in, and they looked up, their expressions a mixture of respect and gratitude. He didn't talk about the past. He didn't mention his family. He pointed to the framed drawing on the wall. "That," he said, his voice finding a familiar, warm, professorial tone, "is by a man who understood that a building's worth isn't determined by an auction house. Its value is in the dreams it inspires, in the work it facilitates, in the quiet moments of discovery that happen within its walls. That is a legacy." He left them to their studies, the soft scratching of their pencils on vellum becoming a new, hopeful sound in the quiet apartment. That evening, Arthur sat in his Eames lounge chair, a cup of tea growing cool beside him. The sun was setting over the Hudson, painting the sky in soft shades of lavender and rose. The apartment was no longer haunted. It was filled with a new quiet energy, the echo of young minds at work. He was no longer a victim, nor an avenger. He was what he had always been, a builder, a mentor, a keeper of beautiful things. He had taken the rubble of his life and built a library. It was the most important project he had ever designed. Use arrow up and arrow down to select a turn, enter to jump to it, and escape to return to the chat.